still anti-Semitism is a live topic. And I found here some videos. There's a series of 6 short videos which deal with different aspects of it. And I think they do a good job. So let me switch back over to that. Why is anti-Semitism still around? Share my screen.
I am so excited today because look what just came in the mail. Our Days United Rosh Hashanah box. I can't wait to open it up and see what's inside.
If you ask most Westerners today whether they oppose anti-Semitism, most would likely say yes. And yet, whenever something terrible happens in the world, it seems like it's only a matter of time.
I've just seen a blank screen.
I'm sorry about that. Let me see what I can do about that. Thank you.
No, seriously, those are all real. The problem is not just
Can hear it,
conspiracy theories.
just
that have
can't see it.
consequences, as massacres of Jews from Pittsburgh to Paris demonstrate.
At lunchtime today, a man armed with
Stop. I am screen sharing. No one is seeing the screen.
We're seeing a big screen, but it's a blank rectangle. At least that's what I'm seeing.
That's what I'm seeing also.
Okay, let's try this. You see anything? You see that
Yeah,
now?
that's
Yeah.
better.
All right.
Now, if you can somehow maximize that
social supermarket
video.
and took
We
more-
see the whole, yeah, there you go.
The gunman was killed, but tragically, so too were 4 of the hostages.
If you ask most Westerners today whether they oppose anti-Semitism, most would likely say yes. And yet, whenever something terrible happens in the world, it seems like it's only a matter of time before someone blames the Jews for it. No, seriously, those are all real. The problem is not just words. It's conspiracy theories that have deadly consequences, as massacres of Jews from Pittsburgh to Paris demonstrate.
At lunchtime today, a man armed with machine guns walked into this kosher supermarket and took more than a dozen people hostage.
The gunman was killed, but tragically, so too were 4 of the hostages.
Far from fading away, anti-Jewish prejudice seems as resilient as ever. So if we agree that anti-Semitism is bad, why is it still such a big problem? That's where this series comes in. By answering some of the biggest questions about anti-Semitism, the sort that confuse many people and keep them from seeing and confronting the hate, we'll learn together how to effectively tackle anti-Semitism, what it actually is, how to recognize it, and what to do about it. Didn't anti-Semitism go away after the Holocaust? Jews will not replace us! Apparently not. Yet a surprising number of people think that anti-Jewish bigotry was stamped out after the horrors of Nazi Germany. After all, didn't we make a bunch of Holocaust movies and get past this stuff? But while it's comforting to imagine that anti-Semitism largely disappeared after World War II, it's far from accurate. And if we make the mistake of reducing anti-Semitism to the Holocaust, its most extreme manifestation, we're likely to miss much of the problem today. That's because the Holocaust wasn't an anti-Semitic exception. It was anti-Semitism's culmination. The systematic murder of 6 million Jews across Europe didn't happen in a vacuum. It came after years of religious, scientific, cultural, and political anti-Semitism. For centuries, European Jews were barred from most professions, forcibly converted to other faiths, and subjected to murderous rampages, constant expulsions, and periodic inquisitions. In other words, the mass murder of European Jewry would not have been possible without many centuries of anti-Jewish ideas and assumptions. Take the Holocaust away, and you still have this massive anti-Semitic foundation underneath. But in fact, we are still living with it. Put another way, just as slavery's abolition in America didn't end racism, the defeat of Nazi Germany didn't end anti-Semitism. The statistics bear this out. According to the FBI, American Jews are annually subject to the most hate crimes of any religious group, despite making up only 2% of the US population. Not only that, but since the FBI began tracking these crimes, more of them have been committed against Jews than all these groups combined. Hate crime statistics are an imperfect metric, but they give you a sense of the ugly anti-Jewish undercurrent that has always lurked beneath the surface. Recently, more people have started to notice this unsettling reality, as American Jews have been subjected to a series of anti-Semitic terrorist attacks and massacres. These include the mass shooting at Pittsburgh's Tree of Life Synagogue in October 2018, the April 2019 attack on a synagogue in Poway, California, the shooting at a kosher supermarket in Jersey City, New Jersey in December 2019.
3 people inside that store were killed by flying pieces of metal during the gunfire.
There is no question that this is a hate crime, and anti-Semitism should be called out aggressively and firmly, immediately for what it is.
And the mass stabbing of religious Jews at their Hanukkah celebration that same month by a machete-wielding assailant in Muncie, New York. Yet as bad as this is, the picture is considerably darker in Europe. In 2018, CNN surveyed European attitudes towards Jewish people. They found that more than a quarter of Europeans believe that Jews have too much influence in finance. Nearly 1 in 4 said that Jews had too much influence in wars and conflicts around the world. 1 in 5 Europeans said that Jews had too much influence in the media, and almost the same number claimed that they have too much influence in politics. These conspiracy theories about vast Jewish power are particularly ludicrous when you realize that Jews constitute less than 0.2% of the entire European population, and most Europeans have never even met one. The consequences of this widespread hostility towards Jews, however, are severe. In 2013 and 2018, researchers at the European Union's Agency for Fundamental Rights asked Jews about their experiences of anti-Semitism. What they found was alarming. Nearly 40% of European Jews were afraid of publicly identifying as Jewish. Nearly half were worried about being the victim of anti-Semitic harassment in the next 12 months. And 1/3 feared being the victim of a physical assault. And for good reason. In recent years, Jews have been the victims of brutal anti-Semitic attacks at schools and synagogues across Europe. Put together, it's easy to understand why so many of Europe's Jews still live in fear 75 years after the Holocaust, why nearly 40% of them say they've considered leaving because they don't feel safe, and why millions of them already have. The same is true in many non-Western countries. Jews in Arab and Muslim lands once numbered nearly 1 million, but now number only a few thousand, having been persecuted to the point of expulsion or flight in the last century. And anti-Jewish prejudice has persisted throughout the region, even in the absence of Jews. Why does this matter to us? Because if we only see and confront anti-Semitism when it looks like the Holocaust or is committed by obvious actors like neo-Nazis, we're likely to miss much of it. Which means that society will only notice the problem when it explodes into deadly violence, as in Pittsburgh or Paris, and it's already too late. Instead, we should understand the Holocaust as a cautionary tale for what happens when more common outgrowths of anti-Semitism go unchecked, and resolve to beat those back together. As for how to do that, well, first we need to settle the biggest question about anti-Semitism of all. Whose fault is anti-Semitism? Whose fault is anti-Semitism? This is probably the most controversial question about anti-Jewish prejudice. Conservatives blame liberals, liberals blame conservatives, Christians blame Muslims, Muslims blame Christians. So who's right? Is there a specific community that drives anti-Semitism? The answer is no. That's because anti-Semitism has always been spread by offenders across the ideological spectrum. What is the worldly religion of the Jew? Huckster declared the godfather of communism, Karl Marx, in 1843. What is his worldly god? Money. Not long after, Marx's contemporary Wilhelm Marr, the right-wing German nationalist who mainstreamed the term anti-Semitism, he was for it, declared that Jews didn't share the same sense of ethics as non-Jews because they preferred to accumulate wealth. Marx and Marr didn't agree on much, but they agreed on those self-serving, money-grubbing Jews. This anti-Semitic agreement didn't just hold among political rivals. For centuries, the Christian church persecuted Europe's Jews as Christ killers and infidels, while Voltaire, the Enlightenment's sharpest critic of the religious establishment, repeatedly assailed Judaism, calling Jews an ignorant, stupid people. These examples are just the tip of the anti-Semitic iceberg. Throughout history, people with entirely opposite worldviews, from Nazi Germany's Adolf Hitler to the Soviet Union's Joseph Stalin, have somehow found a way to agree on one thing: persecuting Jewish people. On the surface, this is pretty confusing, but it makes sense when you understand that anti-Semitism predates our modern categories and stems from something far more fundamental: the human inability to tolerate difference. Jews are the world's oldest minority that has refused to conform to the majority culture. For thousands of years, Jews have persisted in their unique practices and traditions. They were too stubbornly Jewish for religions like Christianity and Islam that sought to convert them, too religious for atheists and free thinkers like Voltaire, too closed off and clannish for the internationalist left like the communists of the Soviet Union who put Jews in gulags, and too worldly and widespread for the nationalist right, who slurred them as corrupt cosmopolitans, undermining the state. As an ever-present minority, Jews have been perpetually scapegoated for the majority's problems, constantly cast as untrustworthy and accused of serving their own interests at the expense of society's. In the biblical book of Esther, the villain Haman tells the king, there is a certain people dispersed among the peoples who keep themselves separate. Their customs are different from all other people, and they do not obey the king's laws. It is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. This 2,000-year-old expression of anti-Semitism could have been written yesterday. Take this recent broadcast by True News, a right-wing Christian news outlet that was accredited by the Trump White House.
That's the way the Jews work. They are deceivers. They plot, they lie, they do whatever they have to do to accomplish their political agenda.
Now listen to this 2015 interview with Jewish Senator Bernie Sanders by Diane Rehm on NPR, the polar opposite of True News. You'll recognize some familiar themes.
Senator, you have dual citizenship with Israel.
Well, no, I do not have dual citizenship with Israel. I'm an American. I don't know where that question came from. No, I'm an American citizen, period.
Jews sought to escape their minority status by founding their own state, Israel. But now anti-Semites just accuse Jews everywhere, like Sanders, of disloyally working for Israel as part of a global conspiracy to control non-Jewish countries. These insinuations find their way from the internet into everyday interactions.
Mr. Cardin looks like a regular white guy, nice guy, whatever, but in actuality, he's a Jewish white guy. And if the public was informed of that by C-SPAN, I think they would take his comments differently. Because this guy is Jewish, that means that he is concerned about Israel.
Eric, I want to give the congressman a chance to respond to that.
I'm normally pretty tolerant to people who ask questions, but I'm not to your assumption. I take great offense to that. This country, our loyalty is to America. Our concerns are to America.
As they have throughout history, conspiracy theories about Jews undermining society have deadly consequences. In 2018, a white supremacist named Robert Bowers, who claimed Jews were scheming to replace whites with brown immigrants, massacred 11 worshipers in a Pittsburgh synagogue. In the years that followed, another white nationalist attacked a synagogue in California, while Black extremists with entirely different worldviews shot up a kosher supermarket in New Jersey and stabbed religious Jews at a Hanukkah gathering in New York. The point here is not that anti-Semitism exists equally in all these communities. It's that no community is immune to anti-Semitism because no community is immune to the instinct to stigmatize difference. Nowhere is this more apparent than Europe, where Jews surveyed from Spain to Sweden report experiencing serious anti-Semitism from all directions. This testimony reflects real-world bigotry. Whether it's Poland's Christian Conservative Party passing laws to repress studying the Holocaust and Polish complicity in it, or Hungary's nationalist leaders leading a state-sponsored campaign demonizing Jewish financier George Soros, blaming him for the country's problems and comparing him to Hitler, or Britain's preeminent left-wing party failing to stop pervasive anti-Semitism in its ranks under leader Jeremy Corbyn, or Jews in France being subjected to countless violent attacks at the hands of Islamic extremists. As you can see, anti-Semitism is the ultimate equal opportunity offender. So why does anti-Semitism continue to flourish across the spectrum? The answer is simple. People only tend to police anti-Jewish bigotry when it comes from the other side, not their own. It's understandable why this happens. After all, it's much easier to condemn the prejudice of people you already despise and disagree with. It's a lot harder to speak up when the bigotry is coming from your friends and allies. But think about it. Where do you have the power to make change? Among your friends or among your enemies? In your community or in someone else's? Yet too often, our national conversation about anti-Semitism consists of people trying to bounce anti-Semites from parties they weren't invited to. Conservatives policing progressive anti-Semitism, progressives policing conservative anti-Semitism, and so on. You don't have to be an expert in anti-Semitism to see why this doesn't work. So how can we stop this from happening and start fighting the anti-Semites instead of each other? The secret is this. Focus on the anti-Semitic ideas expressed, not the individual expressing them. If we train ourselves to recognize anti-Jewish sentiments, rather than getting distracted by their source, we'll be much more successful at identifying and uprooting the hateful ideas across the board. But if we pick and choose which anti-Semitism to care about based on who says it, and give our own community a pass, the bigotry will continue to spread unchecked. Because the truth is, casting anti-Jewish prejudice as a specifically left-wing problem, or right-wing problem, or Christian problem, or Muslim problem, is really just a way of saying that it's someone else's problem. The only people who win this argument over who's the bigger are the anti-Semites, who continue to spread their hate while their supposed opponents point fingers at each other. To truly combat anti-Semitism, we need to stop thinking of it as other people's problem and start confronting it as our problem.
If I can get rid of my dock here.
We were both on a motorcycle together when the girl was texting and driving, didn't even see us, and she T-boned us, knocked us off the bike. Today is my first jump as an amputee. I wanted to do it for my anniversary. An anniversary, it's probably an odd term. It's basically.
Is criticizing Israel anti-Semitic? It's a question that confuses many well-meaning people. Some assume that an attack on the Jewish state must also be an attack on Jews. For instance, evangelical leader Franklin Graham once dubbed criticism of Israeli settlers an assault on God's chosen people. At the same time, others justify their attacks on Jewish people around the world by pointing to Israel's actions, claiming that they are only being anti-Zionist, not anti-Semitic. So what's the deal? Is criticizing the Jewish state anti-Jewish? Not quite. In fact, it happens all the time in Israel itself and among Jews everywhere. Just as someone can oppose the policies of the United States, France, China, or Saudi Arabia, they can oppose the actions of the Israeli government. Doing so doesn't make them a bigot. Objections to Israeli domestic policies, settlements, occupation, or treatment of the Palestinians are political positions, not anti-Semitic slurs. This is true even when the criticism is harsh, controversial, or makes some people uncomfortable. Israel is a country like any other, and it deserves criticism like any other. If that were the end of the conversation, it would make our lives a lot easier. But unfortunately, it's not. That's because criticism of the Jewish state sometimes masks animosity towards Jews, and as a result, anti-Israel movements often attract anti-Jewish bigots. Just look at the website antizionism.org, which is actually run by neo-Nazi white supremacists. This is pretty predictable if you think about it. After all, Israel is home to half the world's Jews. Having that many of them in one place is naturally going to draw the anger and attention of the millions of people who despise Jews and want them to disappear. For this reason, anti-Semites are obsessed with Israel, and it's one of the biggest excuses they use to rationalize their prejudice. In many places, it's not respectable to openly hate Jews, but it is respectable to criticize the Jewish state. And so bigots will say their problem is with Israel when their real problem is with Jews. What does this look like in practice? First, there's the obvious stuff. Around the world, anti-Semites assault Jews and vandalize Jewish schools, synagogues, campus institutions, and even Holocaust memorials over alleged Israeli actions thousands of miles away.
When this began, mid-May, in Gaza and Israel, anti-Semitic incidents in the US spiked. Jewish diners attacked in Los Angeles when a Pro-Palestinian motorcade stopped, men got out and
started running toward the tables and asking indiscriminately who's Jewish.
This is just the usual harassment and violence that Jews have experienced for centuries. Israel is simply the flimsy cover story that perpetrators of these crimes invoke to justify their classically anti-Semitic actions. Then you have traditional anti-Semitic lies that are repurposed as anti-Israel lies. For example, back in the Middle Ages, Jews were repeatedly accused of murdering Gentile children for perverse purposes. Some anti-Semites still make this bizarre medieval accusation known as the blood libel today. But others have adapted it for the 21st century, with some twisting it into the claim that Israel is perpetrating genocide against the Palestinian people. In actuality, according to the Palestinian Central Bureau of Statistics, the Palestinian population in Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza has skyrocketed since Israel's founding in 1948. Whenever one thinks of Israel, that's obviously the opposite of genocide. This false allegation isn't a legitimate argument. It's a blood libel on a national scale, an ugly update of an ancient slander.
إسرائيل الآن يركز على قتل الأطفال، وأنا أظن أنه هذا شيء مكتنز في العقلية الصهيونية والعقلية اليهودية التاريخية التي أدمنت قتل النساء والأطفال، وكلنا يتذكر كيف كان اليهود يذبحون المسيحيين ليخلطوا دماءهم بفطيرهم المقدس.
This is not the only anti-Semitic conspiracy theory that has received an anti-Israel facelift. Take the mother of all anti-Semitic myths, the idea that Jews secretly run the world. Because it's frowned upon to say that the Jews control the economy or government these days, anti-Semites instead insist that Israel or its Zionist supporters do. Robert Bowers, the white supremacist who massacred Jews at a Pittsburgh synagogue, claimed that Zog, Zionist-occupied government, was in control of America's political parties. So did the supreme leader of Iran. All of these anti-Semitic ideas, rebranded as merely anti-Israel, are revealing in that they just replace the word Jew with Israel or Zionist.
We need to end Zionism, which is huge, and it's probably the biggest problem that we have in this country today and around the globe, which is a few people controlling pretty much everything, all the money, all the business, brainwashing all the people from the education systems, everything.
Israel is losing out. They're losing the media war despite their connections. The tide is turning.
What are their connections?
Deep pockets.
What does that mean?
Well, they're very influential people. I mean, they control media.
Other instances of anti-Jewish prejudice disguising themselves as anti-Israel arguments are more subtle. These often involve the Jewish state being subjected to criticism leveled at no other non-Jewish country. Consider the United Nations, whose Human Rights Council has condemned Israel over 70 times in its 14-year history, more than all other countries combined, including vastly worse regimes like China, North Korea, and Russia.
It is also appalling that the council has one standing agenda, and that's Israel.
Here is a bit of context that you might not know. The United Nations from 2012 through 2015 has adopted 97 resolutions specifically criticizing an individual country. And of those 97, 83 of them have focused on Israel. Is Israel truly deserving of 86% of the world's condemnation? Or possibly is something else afoot?
To be clear, the point here is not that Israel has never committed human rights violations that deserve criticism. It's that Israel's violations deserve to be treated like those of any non-Jewish country, but they are not.
For the simple truth is that for as long as Israel has been a member of this institution, Israel has been treated differently from other nations at the United Nations.
Any unbiased observer understands that this is not because Israel is more evil than all other countries, but because it is more Jewish. This disparate treatment was so egregious that in 2017, the US Senate sent a letter to the UN Secretary General, calling on him to combat the institution's bias against Israel. It was signed by all 100 US senators, from Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio to Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. So what's going on here? Why is Israel, a country that certainly merits reasonable criticisms like any other, attracting so many unreasonable attacks? Here's an analogy that helps untangle this. Criticizing Barack Obama doesn't make someone racist, but as the first Black president, he naturally attracted vicious critics motivated by racism. Similarly, criticizing Israel doesn't mean that someone is anti-Semitic, but as the world's only Jewish state, Israel naturally attracts many critics motivated by anti-Semitism. Keep in mind that sometimes a claim can be offensive and wrong without being anti-Semitic. A person might just be repeating something misguided they heard from friends or social media and be speaking from ignorance, not hatred. The inconvenient truth is that there's no simple test for determining whether someone is anti-Israel, anti-Zionist, or just plain anti-Semitic. Anyone who tells you that criticism of Israel or Zionism is always anti-Semitic or never anti-Semitic doesn't seriously understand anti-Semitism. What's important is that we be aware that anti-Semites are drawn to Israel debates, that we are vigilant about rejecting their bigoted baggage, and that we prevent them from corrupting the critical conversation about the Jewish state and its conduct.
You ever wondered what actors and
Hey, so check it out. This is a emergency sleeping bag. These things normally cost $30, and during the wintertime, people pay full price for them all day.
Do Jewish people cause anti-Semitism? This probably seems like an offensive question, and sure sounds like an example of blaming the victim. But a shockingly large number of people believe that Jews cause themselves to be hated, and it's one of the reasons why anti-Semitism has endured for so many centuries. A recent CNN survey found that nearly 1 in 5 Europeans believed that anti-Semitism in their countries was a response to the everyday behavior of Jewish people. An even more commonly expressed version of this belief is the claim that Israel causes anti-Semitism. And that's just the ones who admitted it to a pollster. So back to the question, do Jews or the Jewish state cause anti-Semitism? If we're going to uproot anti-Jewish prejudice, it's crucial to understand exactly why the claim is so egregiously wrong, logically, historically, and morally. Unfortunately, the idea that Jews are responsible for their own persecution is not some fringe idea. Take Swedish Public Radio, the country's equivalent of NPR. In early 2015, host Helena Grohl interviewed Isaac Bachman, Israel's ambassador to Sweden, in the wake of 2 deadly anti-Semitic attacks in Europe. But Grohl didn't ask the Israeli envoy what non-Jews could do to stop this virulent anti-Semitism. Instead, she asked,
Do the Jews themselves have any responsibility in the growing anti-Semitism that we see now?
Bachman, unsurprisingly, was shocked.
Well, I reject the question altogether. The question of how a woman contributes for the fact of being raped is irrelevant altogether. I don't think that there's any provocation the Jews are doing. They just exist.
As we noted in an earlier video, the European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights has found that 60% of Swedish Jews fear to publicly identify as Jewish. That Grohl, a respected member of the media, felt comfortable blaming Jews for their own abuse helps explain why. Grohl didn't stop digging, however. She went on.
But a lot of people would look at the Middle East today and say there is conflicts that we know between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And a lot of people might say, we see the Gaza war, we see things that have been happening, that the Israelis and the Jews in Israel have a responsibility to reactions that are coming.
After outrage on social media over this bizarre exchange, the public radio station apologized for the interview and purged it from their online archives. But erasing the evidence of bigotry is not the same as confronting and debunking it. In her interview, Grohl said that a lot of people think as she does. So why are these people mistaken? Simply put, the idea that Jews or Israel cause anti-Semitism is wrong for 3 interrelated reasons: logic, history, and morality. Logic. Take the notion, sometimes presented by well-meaning people, that Jews came to be despised as miserly and greedy because they were forbidden from owning land or holding most occupations, and so were compelled to become moneylenders in the Middle Ages. The argument is that Jews came to be associated with money and thus hated for their money. Jewish behavior caused Jew hatred. It's a very convenient tale to explain anti-Semitism, but it doesn't actually make sense. After all, why were Jews restricted from so many professions and not permitted to own land? The underlying anti-Semitism predated the conduct that allegedly caused it. Supposed Jewish miserliness was an excuse for anti-Semitism, not the explanation. This underscores a fundamental point. Like most groups subjected to bigotry, Jews are hated not because of what they do, but because of who they are, a small minority that is different from the majority. This intolerant dynamic stays the same, while the justifications for it change over time. That's why if you get rid of one rationale for anti-Semitism, a new one just takes its place. And these explanations never stand up to scrutiny. History. Take the claim that the modern state of Israel, the home of half the world's Jews, causes anti-Semitism. Studies and headlines show that when the Jewish state engages in military action, anti-Semitic acts tend to spike in parts of Europe. But if we reflect on the last 1,000 years of history, we see that once again, this is not the cause of the anti-Semitism, it's the cover story for it. From the Crusades to the Spanish Inquisition to the Holocaust, anti-Semitism plagued Europe and beyond long before Israel was established in 1948. The Jewish state couldn't provoke any of these anti-Jewish assaults. It didn't exist. In fact, Europe's utter inability to protect its Jews was a major reason why many of them fled to found their own state. The effort to pin Jew hatred on the Jewish state, then, is an attempt to invert cause and effect in order to evade historical responsibility. But ascribing anti-Semitism to Jews or Israel is not just wrong logically and historically. It's also wrong morally. We don't consider it acceptable or understandable to blame the victims of bigotry in any other context, or at least we shouldn't. It's never okay to attack random Jews over the actions of completely different Jews thousands of miles away in the Middle East. Just like it's never okay to attack random Muslims over the actions of Muslim groups or countries thousands of miles away in the Middle East. It's as absurd and offensive as assailing a French person in New York over the actions of French people in Paris. This sort of racist thinking isn't the cause of anti-Semitism. It's the essence of anti-Semitism. That people still blame Jews or Israel for anti-Semitism in polite company, just as today many still blame Black people for racism or women's dress for rape, shows just how embedded anti-Jewish assumptions still are, even in educated enclaves. But while anti-Semites may cite Jewish actions to justify their prejudice, we know better, and we don't have to fall for it. Jews don't cause anti-Semitism. Anti-Semites do. In October 2017, ex-CIA agent and noted anti-war activist Valerie Plame shared an article from an anti-Semitic website with her 50,000 Twitter followers. Its title, "America's Jews Are Driving America's Wars." As outrage mounted, Plame defended her choice by noting, "I am of Jewish descent," an apparent reference to her single Jewish grandparent. On the surface, this sounds like a compelling case. After all, can a Jew or someone with Jewish heritage really be anti-Semitic or say anti-Semitic things? As it turns out, yes. To understand how, we've got to go all the way back to the Middle Ages to someone you've probably never heard of. In 1238, a Jewish apostate named Nicholas Donin traveled to Rome and personally denounced the Talmud as anti-Christian to Pope Gregory IX. This set in motion a chain of events that led to the largest mass burning of the Talmud in recorded history, with some 10 to 12,000 volumes of the foundational Jewish works set ablaze in France. This was before the advent of the printing press, and these books were all handwritten and irreplaceable. The event was so traumatic that for hundreds of years on Tisha B'Av, the National Jewish Day of Mourning, observant Jews have recited a haunting prayer commemorating the tragedy. And all of this happened because of a Jew. Sad to say, Donin's story is not unique. Historically, Jews have excelled at many things, including anti-Semitism. This can seem counterintuitive at first glance, but it's also quite well documented. and one doesn't have to go back to the 13th century to find it. Take Gilad Atzmon, a noted musician and activist living in London today. In 2011, he published a book called The Wandering Who? A Study of Jewish Identity Politics. It's a cartoonishly anti-Semitic tract. In it, Atzmon dubs American Jews the enemy within, questions the historical facts of the Holocaust, and claims that robbery and hatred are inherent to Jewish political ideology. Atzmon has also compiled lists of suspect Jews in the US government and declared, "We must begin to take the accusation that the Jewish people are trying to control the world very seriously." Consider another British personality, Jackie Walker. As a leader of the powerful leftist political group Momentum, Walker was instrumental in consolidating power for Jeremy Corbyn, the former British Labour Party leader from 2015 to 2020. Her work was even spotlighted in the New York Times. She also labeled Jews the chief financiers of the African slave trade, a libel long debunked by historians. When confronted with the facts, Walker not only refused to apologize, but insisted she could not be anti-Semitic because she possessed Jewish heritage. She subsequently questioned whether Jewish schools needed additional security protection and criticized Britain's Holocaust Memorial Day. This phenomenon of Jewish anti-Semitism is not limited to one part of the political spectrum. In 2016, in the heat of the US presidential campaign, Joshua Seidel wrote an op-ed for the Jewish newspaper The Forward titled, "I'm a Jew and I'm a member of the alt-right." In it, he defended the typical anti-Jewish rhetoric often heard from this openly anti-Semitic part of America's political spectrum. Even the son of Israel's prime minister once shared an anti-Semitic cartoon about a Jewish conspiracy that was then championed by white supremacist David Duke. Here's the thing. While all of these individuals cite their heritage as a shield against accusations of anti-Jewish animus, that's a distraction, not an argument. Racism is racism, no matter who says it. It's the substance of bigotry that matters, not the source. So why do some Jews do this? In general, there seem to be two chief motivations behind such behavior. The first is that minorities often absorb stereotypes about themselves from the majority. When everyone around you shares certain assumptions about your community, it can be easy to subconsciously accept them. This is how Karl Marx, who was ethnically Jewish, but whose father converted to Christianity, could write things like, "What is the worldly religion of the Jew? Huckstering. What is his worldly God? Money." Scholars call this internalized racism, and it's something many Jews and other minorities have experienced. More insidious are those Jews who adopt the assumptions of anti-Semites wholesale and make them their political program. For these individuals, anti-Semitism is a punch card to power in places where their community is despised and ostracized. By separating themselves from most other Jews and justifying prejudice towards them, these people hope to insulate themselves from anti-Semitism and obtain influence among growing political movements that are otherwise hostile to Jews. By throwing other Jews under the anti-Jewish bus, they hope to save themselves from it. For this reason, Donin sought to prove his Christian cred by denouncing the Talmud to the church. Joshua Seidel attempted to insinuate himself into the alt-right by defending their anti-Jewish conduct. And Jackie Walker aimed to access the elite of the British Labour Party, which was later found by a government watchdog to have engaged in widespread anti-Semitic conduct by repeating and defending anti-Semitic ideas. But the truth is, nothing about these people's Jewish background makes their words or actions less reprehensible. When Miko Peled, an anti-Israel activist and son of an Israeli general, justified calling Jews sleazy thieves, the fact that he was Jewish didn't make the stereotype any less racist. And when Plame tweeted that America's Jews are driving America's wars, her claim of Jewish descent didn't make it any less bigoted. Whether a Jew engages in anti-Semitism for ideological or psychological reasons, the end result is the same and should never be excused.
Ready to start eating healthier? Meet Kachava. Kachava is the world.
Jews are just 0.2% of the global population. With so many problems to address in the world, does anti-Jewish prejudice really deserve so much of our attention? It's true that anti-Semitism seems to impact Jews alone, but in reality, it's quite dangerous for everyone else. Here's why. Most of the time, prejudice hurts those it targets and empowers those who spread it, much like slavery and segregation enriched America's white majority at the expense of its Black minority. But anti-Semitism is a unique case and uniquely corrosive to those societies that embrace it. That's because it often takes the form of a conspiracy theory about how the world works, conjuring sinister, string-pulling Jewish puppet masters who are said to be behind the world's economic, political, and social problems. And here's the thing. By blaming real problems on imagined Jewish culprits, anti-Semitism prevents people from rationally solving those problems. This creates a self-sabotaging dynamic in which people become obsessed with scapegoating Jews and can't overcome their society's real challenges. A famous example of this involves the scientists of Nazi Germany. Even as they raced against the Allied powers for scientific and military advantage, the Third Reich shunned Albert Einstein's advances as subpar Jüdische Physik, Jewish physics, as opposed to their own superior Deutsche Physik, German physics. The anti-Semitism that permeated their society also blinded them to reality and fortunately led to their downfall. This phenomenon of anti-Jewish bigotry undermining the bigots is an old one. Economist Luigi Pascali of the University of Warwick has found that a portion of the economic gap between northern and southern Italy can be traced to declines in areas that expelled their Jews during the 1500s, who were essential to the country's banking and financial success. By blaming Jews for their society's problems, the country's anti-Semites actually made them worse for generations to come. Similarly, a 2017 National Bureau of Economic Research study found that families living in historically anti-Semitic German areas were less likely to invest in the stock market due to inherited anti-Jewish attitudes. Anti-Semites associate Jews with money and economic domination. As a result, they needlessly shun the stock market and fail to use it to their advantage. So you see, anti-Semitism doesn't just impoverish Jewish people, it impoverishes anti-Jewish people. Historian Walter Russell Mead once pointed to exactly this phenomenon to explain why he writes so much about anti-Jewish prejudice. Quote, societies that tolerate anti-Semitism take a fateful step toward the loss of both freedom and prosperity. People who think the Jews run the banks lose the ability to understand, much less to operate financial systems. People who think the Jews dominate politics lose their ability to interpret political events, to diagnose social evils, and to organize effectively for positive change. People who think the Jews run the media and control the news lose the ability to grasp what is happening around them.
What happens is that conspiracies divert people from actually solving real issues by distracting them with fantasies. And the most exciting fantasy is one where people get to hate on Jews. Anti-Semitism has real impact beyond just hate crimes. It distorts our understanding of how the actual world works. It isolates us. It alienates us from our communities, from our neighbors, and from participating in governance. It kills, but it also kills our society.
In other words, anti-Semitism is the rare hatred that really destroys the hater. Rooting out anti-Semitic assumptions, then, is not simply necessary for the sake of the Jews, but for the sake of society itself.
Stop sharing here. Stop sharing, that's what I want to do. Well, I thought that was pretty pertinent and was really pleased to find such a concise coverage of so many things. I'm sorry that more people didn't watch it, but we'll put a note in the bulletin next week and say this is a good thing to watch. Well, I say that. Is anybody, how do the rest of you feel? Others of you? John, thank you. I grew there. Like a lot of people in southern towns, particularly small towns, I knew only one Jewish family. They lived in San Antonio, but they drove 30 miles south to run the Jew store. And the Jew store, there's a woman who writes about that, about the same thing where she was growing up in the South. And it was not, I just thought of it as that's what happened in my town, but it happened in a lot of towns apparently. And there, as in my town, it was primarily, we had almost no blacks, but it primarily catered to Mexicans. It was near the Mexican side of town. And so they were able to draw an audience that if they had been in the center of town, which was 2 blocks away, they might not have had much of an audience. But I didn't think much about that, except I liked a T-shirt that I bought there, and I like Mr. Silas Berman a lot. Hello, little Martin. So I bought a T-shirt there, and my mother says, "Where'd you get that?" I said, "Berman, the Jew store." Yeah, she said, "Well, it's okay." But there was a soft bit of anti-Semitism or prejudice there that didn't manifest it too much, but there was. I grew up around some of that. Got to watch those Jews. They're pretty sharp traders, things like that. It's just runs pretty deeply in our society and in the world. I ask my students sometime, what do you think the population, the Jewish population of America is? And I don't say call out your name, just how many think. I'll just give different percentages. You know, it's not half, so 40%, 30%, 20%, 10. And by that time, most people's hands are up. Come down to 2%. And that is a fact that almost none of the students who weren't Jewish knew. And in Europe, I was surprised to see, not totally, but surprised to see that in Europe, the Jewish population is 0.2%. That is, and still regarded as a real threat to the European Union. Anyone have any operate? John?
Wouldn't that be a result of the Holocaust, Bill, about the European population being
Sure. Not only diminishing it by 6 million, but by just moving out because of what the Holocaust represented. You know, looking at those countries where the countries had gone down in Africa and other places where the population had been considerable and just shrinks down like that. There was not a Holocaust in a lot of those countries, but still the recognition, we need to go somewhere else. We need to go to a place that is safer.
I'm going to ask my buddy who grew up in Cuero. I said, Robert, how did you, a Jewish guy, end up in Cuero, Texas? He said, I don't know. Ask my grandfather. I'm going to ask him if his grandfather's store was known as the Jewish store, because he had a dry goods store in Cuero. Anyway, that's strange that it was known as the Jewish store.
Just the Jew store.
Jew store, yeah, whatever.
I suspect. I can't remember the woman who's a writer. She was a political writer, but she also she loved baseball, wrote a book about that. It'll come to me in a moment, but that's a little bit late.
Doris Kearns Goodwin.
Doris Kearns Goodwin. Thank you. Doris Kearns Goodwin. Thank you. Some young person remembers her name. I had her face, absolutely. But anyway, she wrote about that and talking about where she grew up, the Jew store, and that same kind of thing. Anyway, I don't know that anyone ever harassed Mr. Silas Berman for his store, but not many Anglo people, non-Jewish people, Gentiles, shop there as far as I know. All right. Yes, David.
Well, I was just going to say, growing up in small towns in Kansas and Oklahoma, I had never actually encountered a Jew till my family moved to Beaumont, Texas. And then I didn't realize that Scott Rodden was Jewish until some of the other guys on the football team were teasing him about having wine at Sabbath supper before he came to play football. And he was such a good defensive lineman that nobody would mess with him. But that was my first encounter with a Jew that I knew about. That and Nancy Blum, who was in my math class, and I thought was very cute. But anyway, not much encounter with Jews in my household until we moved to Houston.
Well, mine was mainly going to my favorite men's store, boys store, or young men's store and men's store in San Antonio was Joseph's, and it was clearly a Jewish store, and these were my haberdashers. That was back in the days before Costco became my haberdasher. But my father had a man that he did different kinds of deals with, but he was also, he'd say things like, you got to be careful, So anyway, well, thank you all for coming, and see you in a little while.